There we go. It should ask you all for permission to do that. And the broadcast meeting part, here we go, working out.
So while Marcy's doing that, I would love to know who's in the room. So if you want to drop in the chat, I'll see your name, but if you just want to drop in the chat what you do, so we can see the range of kind of folks who are here, and then we can, it helps me to know how we want to guide the discussion a little bit.
Just drop that in the chat, folks, like kind of where you're from or what your role is. Cool.
Great.
Got a lot of cool people with us today.
Yeah.
Recordings such are live. If anyone needs the transcript, I'll make sure that that's on.
A child life specialist. I love child life specialists. I did this really cool project about, well, it's 12 years ago at this point, and I went to several of the the National Child Life conferences and ran some focus groups. And I thought, gosh, if I had not become a social worker, I could have been a child life worker.
Some great roles on hand. There's a hands person. Oh, I love it.
Yeah.
Thank you all for all you do.
Health departments, parents. Great. Really glad to have parents. Working with kids, working with adults, drug court. Great. Okay. So really nice. Oh, good. And a student, at least one student. That's wonderful. I see a few names I recognize. So, okay. Great. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Well, I will turn it over to you, Miriam, and run this as you like.
Okay, great. So nice to have everybody here. I'm a little bit of a talker, but I'm going to try to set us up with some context about how I came to be thinking about moving beyond ACEs, and then hopefully we can have some conversation. But please feel free to jump in either in the chat or even to unmute and say something, because that's the point of this. So I can see Christine Bobko. So if you're seeing the slides, can you give me a thumbs up, Christine? Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. So the title of this talk is Moving Beyond ACEs, Positive Childhood Experiences Matter Too. And so we'll talk about what this idea of positive childhood experiences are. Just a little bit about me. I currently work as the Trauma and Resilience Advisor at the Department for Behavioral Health, Developmental and Intellectual Disabilities, and I work across the entire Cabinet for Health and Family Services, and also do some consultation to the Department of Education around trauma and resilience work. So that's a pretty broad swath. My background is that I'm a clinician by training. I worked at Mountain Comprehensive Care in Eastern Kentucky many, many moons ago, and then at UK Psychiatry at the Center on Trauma and Children, and branched out while I was at the center into doing research and training, and then came to the state a few years ago. Here's a little bit about me personally. I am extremely proud of that top picture of me next to the muddy motorcycle. I had the privilege of being in Madagascar in July doing some work with a healthcare NGO. And in order to get to one of the remote sites, I had to ride on the back of a motorcycle with my driver standing next to me for 2 hours over very, very, very rural, bumpy, muddy, crazy roads. And I am not a motorcyclist. I had actually never ridden on a bike before. So I was very excited about that. He, I think too, was quite relieved. He was quite worried when he saw my gray hair. Like many parts of the world, people don't get gray in Madagascar. So I think they thought I was really, really, really old. And I think it made him a little nervous, but we did it all okay. So we are all humans in this world, and it's important for us, even when we're talking about really heavy things and important things, to remember our shared humanity. So encourage you always to share a little bit about yourselves with each other, and that human part. And of course, there's my daughter, my lovely daughter, but also my favorite dog. So just like to point those things out. Okay, we are going to be talking about the issue of trauma and resilience, and I always remind you to pay attention to your own needs. One of the great advantages of virtual discussions is that we can take some time away if we need to. But one of the things we know about trauma and about the way that we respond and some of the secondary trauma reactions that we have is that sometimes when we're doing the work, we are fine. And it's later on when we pause or stop or reflect that things kind of wash over us or we feel them differently. And so if that happens to you, either in your work or in your parenting role or in when you're at a workshop, please know that that is very normal. And it's just really important to pause and have some moments of reflection and think, gosh, what is happening? What am I feeling? What am I thinking? And what do I need to do to process that? I also will encourage you to take care of yourself in ways that really help you to metabolize those thoughts and those feelings. We talk a lot, or we had been talking a lot for a long time about self-care. If you'll notice, I don't use that language. I use self-awareness. I think self-care has been a little bit diluted into bubble baths and kale and yoga, and those things are really lovely and they're really important, and sometimes they're really helpful, but they're probably not enough unless they're happening in concert with ways that you are actually noticing what you're thinking, what you're feeling, and then processing those things. So just a little PSA about all of that. And to pay attention, take care of yourself however you need to as we have this particular conversation today and in general. So I would love to ask you two questions. If you used a rating scale from 0 to 10, 0 being not at all comfortable, and comfort comes also from knowledge about adverse childhood experiences, and 10 feeling like you're an expert in them, just drop in the chat where you think you are on that scale. Great. I'm seeing lots of things about ACEs being high, and if you want, you can do both. I was going to do them separately, but I see you guys are way ahead of the game and thought of a better way to do it. So yes, seeing some differences between people's comfort levels with ACEs and with PCEs. And so that's great. So for those of you who are comfortable with both, please feel free to jump in if you have a different view or some ideas. And for those of you who are not as comfortable with positive childhood experiences and some of the work that's happening in that realm, we will talk. Hopefully this will be a way of introducing you to that. We are not going to spend as much time talking about adverse childhood experiences other than some of the history around that, but I will drop in the chat at the end, or maybe Marcy can do this while we're doing this. You can go to the CDC website and just pull up CDC ACEs, and maybe also some of the other places I already have in the resources, but I didn't put that link in. So, and I'll share the slides with Marcy, and she can send them out to anybody who is participating today. All right. So in 1998, many of you know that there was this quiet journal article in a journal that actually we wouldn't normally read as behavioral health providers. It was a preventive medicine journal, and it was a combined study from the CDC and Kaiser Permanente in California. And it talked about this idea of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and their relationship to later health concerns. And the history behind this study, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is that there was a project in California at Kaiser Permanente around obesity, and a doctor there, Vincent Folletti, was doing it, and he noticed that there was a group of folks who were having great success and losing weight according to this protocol, and then they were all of a sudden they stopped losing weight, and they were not only not losing more weight, but regaining the weight that they had lost. So like any good scientist, he kept asking why, what's going on here? What's going on here? And ultimately, after lots and lots of talking and questioning with these folks in this study, discovered that the only thing that they all had in common in terms of their physical well-being or their psychological well-being was that they all had experience something unpleasant in their childhoods. And he started asking the question about how could these two things be related? How could something bad that happens in childhood be connected to obesity later in life? And he started talking about this, and people actually said to him, stop talking about this. People think you're crazy. You're going to ruin your reputation and your career. Until one day he was asking this question out loud in a group of scientists, and somebody from the CDC said, there's somebody at the CDC you need to talk to. And that person was Bob Anda, the second author on this study. And they got together and ultimately did this enormous study that looked at adult health outcomes, or adult health status, and connected it to a bunch of childhood adversities. And these childhood adversities were mostly things that happen within the family. So was somebody in your family incarcerated? Was somebody in your family suffering from a mental health problem? Exposure to substance abuse, exposure to any kind of child abuse, a variety of things like that. 10. They started out with 7, they went up to 8, they landed on 10. Okay. So out of this study, we learned 3 really big things. And the reason I said it was a little bit of a sleeper is because it took a little bit of time before people really picked up on why this study was so important, because these things were so transformative. For those of us who were in the field, they were confirmation of things that we had been seeing and intuiting, but as we know, the research always matters. So the first thing that we learned is that this population of 17,000 plus people who were in the Kaiser Permanente insurance pool. So remember, that means that they were either working and had private insurance, or they were purchasing private insurance. They were mostly white, they were mostly college educated, they were primarily middle class, had relatively high rates of adversity during their childhood. So 1 in 3 had one of the ACEs that were on the list, and about 1 in 5 had multiple number of ACEs, 3 or more. I realized I didn't put on here that, well, I'll say it in just a minute. The second thing we learned that was really incontrovertible is that in this study, it showed very clearly that psychosocial adversity during childhood can impact health and well-being across the lifespan in really profound ways. So that what matters and what happens in childhood matters, not only for childhood, but for the lifespan. And it matters not only for our psychological and social well-being, but it matters for our health. And that caught the attention of people because, there had been folks talking about mind-body connections, but we'd never seen a real through line like this until this study. And then we also saw very clearly that there was a dose response. So the more adversity you had during childhood, the more it impacted your trajectory of health and well-being across your lifespan. And so this was really, really important, but it took a long time for people both in the behavioral health world and in the health world to really pick up on it. So over the next 10 years or so, people started to pay attention. And many of you know the work of Nadine Burke-Harris, the former Surgeon General of California, who really had this wonderful TED Talk where she talked about she couldn't understand as a pediatrician why people weren't literally shouting this from the rooftops and saying, hey, y'all, we need to be doing something about this. But as we know, it takes usually 17 years. Yes, I said it right. 17 years from bench to bedside. That means 17 years for research to actually go down and change practice, which is ridiculous, and hopefully it's shortening with the internet. All right, so that's kind of the background of how this all got started and this idea of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, came to be. Over the next 10 plus years, and well, really since then, there has been a tremendous amount of work. That study has been replicated. It's been replicated with other populations, and we have seen without much doubt that we know that what happens in childhood across all populations, not just that white middle class college educated privately insured population, has an impact on our lifespan, and that we see that it can be even a more powerful impact if you are Black or brown, if you are poor, if you have multiple adversities. And we started to really pay attention to things like toxic stress, the idea that cumulative trauma can have a profound impact. We started to talk about this concept of complex trauma, which is not a diagnosis, but is a way of thinking about how some people respond to multiple childhood traumas and how it impacts multiple domains of their functioning. We really started looking at trauma-informed care and why that's so important across multiple disciplines and domains. Places like the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University, which is a fabulous place if you work with young children, a great center, and has tons and tons of resources. The Child Trauma Academy, which is Bruce Perry, who you may know from his work with Oprah, they were both in existence already, but they really started to explode. And we started to understand the neuroscience because people started to ask, how is this connected? How is it that something that happens in the social realm and the psychological realm has such a profound impact on the body? And so we really started to understand the brain science and the neuroscience behind it. And with that, we understood this concept of neuroplasticity even more. And we started to have real data to support it. So just for folks who may not be familiar with the idea of neuroplasticity, in a nutshell, neuroplasticity means that our brains, especially during childhood, are changing and they're capable of change. So we know that in early childhood, the brains of children are growing and developing at this really accelerated rate. And so what happens in early childhood is very important. And we can't have this tremendous capacity for learning both good things and learning things that aren't so good. And when we talk about learning, we mean learning in not just the way that we think about it in terms of cognitive learning, but learning the way to function in all kinds of realms. But what we started to understand about neuroplasticity is that in addition to our brains being plastic during childhood, having this tremendous capacity for growth and change, with the 2 times that are most have the most ability is early childhood and then in adolescence again, is that actually our brains have the capacity to change throughout our lives, which is really good news. So we can learn new things and we can change habits. And also that very profound time of neuroplasticity that we thought of as childhood actually extends to age 25. So this was really good news because it meant that even if yucky things happened in childhood and it changed certain aspects of brain functioning, we had a lot of time and a lot of ability to make repairs, to help people feel comfortable and safe in new ways. So one of the ways that that our brains change from trauma is that we don't feel safe in certain situations. And that's because we develop a way of thinking, a pathway and a way of surviving that is literally has to do with neural pathways and the neuroscience of the neurology of our brain that says beware, right? So once you've had one negative experience, you pay attention. But if you've had multiple negative experiences in a certain realm, you're going to be even more aware. Well, what neuroplasticity said is, just because that's happened to somebody, it doesn't mean that they're always going to have to be really anxious and fearful in that. But we can't just say once to them, oh, it's okay, you don't have to be afraid of this, and it will change. That changing the pathways in the brain takes practice and time and repetition. So this really was important information for us as behavioral health providers, but also as a society, to say we have to have more patience and we also have to have hope. Okay. So the ACEs study then continued to really grow, and people realized, oh, you know what, those first 10 ACEs, they're not enough. There's a lot of other crap that happens to people that we need to be paying attention to. Sorry for my language. And I'm sorry, I realized that the animations aren't working, but in California in particular, Nadine Burke-Harris created a screener called the Pearl screener, where she added some elements to that those first elements of the adverse childhood experiences. And then when she became Surgeon General, she said, you know what, we've done a lot of work in California. She had modeled a way of pediatricians actually screening kids and families and then making referrals. And this is really beautiful. And it's a lot of work. And they did a lot of preparation for this, because you have to have systems that are ready to support the families who are identified. And I want to point something out, which is that Bob Anda always says ACEs are not destiny, right? And just because you've had exposure to childhood trauma and adversity doesn't mean that you're going to have negative outcomes. It means that your risk is increased. There's lots of reasons why not everybody has a negative outcome, and some people do better and do very, very well, actually. And so that's what we really had to start to pay attention to. So before we get there, I just want to say that part of this expansion of ACEs yielded some really important things that I want to make sure you're aware of. So out of the Center for Community Resilience at George Washington University, Wendy Ellis and her colleagues developed this pair of ACEs, which really paid attention to the adverse community environments and recognized that those also have a profound effect. So if you are in the public health realm, and you talk about social determinants of health, this fits very nicely with that. And so we started to expand our understanding of what does it mean to experience adversity in childhood, and where can that adversity be located and happen. Since then, we've actually expanded beyond just that pair of ACEs to 3 realms, understanding climate and environment as another area of adversity. And I think the last, like Kentucky in the last 3 years is a profound example of that. Pandemic is probably related to climate and environment, and the tornadoes, the flooding, et cetera, that we're experiencing, which obviously presents some adversity. So just some ways for you to think about this and expand this idea of what adverse childhood experiences could include. All right. We also then started to say, you know what? If we're going to help kids and families, and as a society, if we're going to move beyond just thinking about adversities, we want to think about what does it mean to be healing centered and healing focused. And so the work of Sean Ginwright around healing centered engagement started to evolve in the 90s and aughts, and then even more recently. And he talked about the fact that healing doesn't just happen in the therapist's office or in the doctor's office, that healing is a political, and he means political in the broadest sense, community level activity, and that it's all of our responsibilities to be aware of how we contribute or maybe inhibit healing and recovery, and also how we contribute to risk, and we need to pay attention to it. So this was happening at the same time that we were really starting to realize that we needed to understand the idea of resilience and what makes people resilient, and how do we build resilience, and how is all of this located in a larger place. Now, I was a therapist for many years, and I always said, you know, the majority of the work does not happen in the 1 hour a week in therapy. And of course, right now, you're lucky if you get 1 hour a week of therapy, right? Because people are so busy. And if you're not getting regular appointments, then it doesn't really, it's more support than therapy. But what we know is that the real work of change and recovery and healing and even prevention happens in our real lives, in our families, in our schools, in our workplaces, in our communities, in our faith centers, etc. And so we started to really understand that if we were going to really help kids, we not only had to train therapists, but we had to train all and build the capabilities of all of the adults in the lives of children, that every single adult who interacts with a child is a part of this process and can be creating this healing centered engagement and mitigating the potential negative effects of adversity and promoting resilience. And so this became a really strong movement, I would say, over the last 5 to 10 years in the field. So I just want to say that, you know, resilience, I think, is still not a well-defined concept. You know, trauma, it took us a long time to understand what we mean by trauma, and trauma is still misused a lot. But I give you some of the ways that we think about resilience. I don't happen to love the APA definition of resilience, but it's out there. And until they change it, that's out there. I like the idea that we are bouncing forward, not just bouncing back, because I think we're always changed from our experiences in both ways, good and bad. And sometimes the change is that we do heal, but we carry a bit of a scar, visible or not visible, and we've learned from it in some way. But what I really like in terms of thinking about resilience is some of the thinking behind these three folks. Resmo Menakem, if you don't know his work, he's a beautiful book called My Grandmother's Hands, around trauma and resilience. And he talks about resilience as being a flow. Resilience is not a thing or an attribute, but a flow. It moves through the body and between multiple bodies when they are harmonized. And I think it's really important that we take resilience out of being located in us as individuals and move it into the community. So I love that quote, and I love his work because of that, because he really locates it there. Anne Maston is kind of the grandmother of work around resilience in children. She's brilliant. She's been doing this work for 40, maybe 50 years now. And Anne Maston has also recently really said very publicly and in lots of her writing, her recent writing, that resilience is also about relationships, and that it is not located within the child, that we're not just building it within the child, we are supporting it within the child by building it around all children. And so I love this idea that it's distributed among all of these relationships. And so we all have a role in it. And then this last one is from this guy, Thomas Hübel, he's a really interesting guy. I don't know a whole lot about him. I'm just starting to follow his work. He's kind of brilliant. He is German and lives between Germany and Israel. Get your head around that. And so that's I think a really interesting way to think about resilience. And he's a little bit of a hippy dippy, but I really like his work. But I was listening to him last summer on a webinar, and he said, resilience is my ability to stay related to my challenges. And I love that because it connects the fact that resilience is not separate from adversity. All right, so and then the APA tells us, gives us some guides for how we can build resilience. And Maston's work led to what we call the resilience wheel that some folks put together for how we build resilience in kids. And the Center for Community Resilience has just recently, in the last few months, released this new resilience tree, which I happen to love, and it kind of mirrors the pair of ACEs. So the roots talk about how we build resilience to minimize adverse community environments, and then or the roots talks about the infrastructure, and then the leaves talk about how that will manifest. And so I really love this way of thinking about this. But what I really wanted to get to today is that we've now started to understand that in addition to adverse childhood experiences not being good for kids, yes, Catherine, I will make sure that you have the slides. What is important is that we also pay attention to what is going well. Now, if you have been working with kids, or if you have been in the field of mental health, I hope that you've been paying attention to things like protective factors and promotive factors, the strengthening families model. We've been talking about this for a long time. But you also know that until there's research, sometimes it doesn't change the way that we're really thinking about things. So you become like one of those therapists. So yeah, you're the strengths-based person, or you're a social worker, so you're strengths-based. And so in 2019, Christina Bethel at Johns Hopkins published this article in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, that said, hey, y'all, ACEs are important, but so are positive childhood experiences, PCEs. Now, this was not as big a study as the original ACE study, so we have to think about this as emerging research, right? She had a much smaller sample size, but what she did was she used data that existed, and she mined it in the same way that they had looked back. So she used data from adults about their childhoods and their current health status. And she said, hey, what in their childhood that was good seemed to connect to better outcomes for them as adults. And what she discovered was that there were 7 positive childhood experiences. So we now need to continue to study this. Now, as you'll see, these 7 the way that they're framed, they're a little weird. Like, sometimes some of them make sense. 3 of them are located within the family and home, able to talk about families about your feelings. This is for kids, feel able to. That makes sense. Felt their family stood by them during difficult times. So remember, this is in the past tense because this was adults reporting from their childhood. And felt safe and protected. Well, intuitively, those three things clearly are helpful to kids and we would think about as being positive, and that having them would be helpful and not having them could be harmful. And then in the school and community, it was a sense of belonging in high school. So, you may be thinking, oh, well, why didn't they think about school in general? Well, that's what they asked about. And that probably came from some previous research because that's the way you design the questions, or what was available in this data set that she was looking at. Felt supported by friends, had at least 2 non-parent adults who took a genuine interest in them, and enjoyed participating in community traditions. And, that's pretty vague. Like, what exactly does that mean? What community is that? Like your faith community? Is that your cultural community? Blah, blah, blah. So there's we still have some questions about this. But what was really profound about this study in 2019 and caught my eye and made me excited and start to follow her work a little bit more was that she discovered 2 things. She discovered that ACEs, and I can't remember. She discovered that ACEs were really important that positive childhood experiences were really important to mitigate the negative effect of adverse childhood experiences. So if you've had an adverse childhood experience, but you have some or all of these positive experiences, you're probably going to do better. So that's good news. And so it tells us, if kids have had adverse childhood experiences, we need to make sure that we're building up these elements and probably some others for them. And again, that makes sense, but this was good confirmation. But she also found something else that I think is really important. And what she found was that even if you haven't had ACEs, you need these things. So if you haven't had adversity, but you also don't get this stuff, you're still not going to do as well. In fact, people who were in that neutral zone where they weren't having bad stuff happen, but they also weren't getting the good stuff, maybe weren't doing as well as people who had had bad stuff happen, but also had good stuff. And that was a big change because we were so focused on preventing ACEs that I think we were overlooking that those middle folks who maybe weren't having bad stuff happen, but also weren't getting enough good stuff or any good stuff. And so, as Marcy just said, positive childhood experiences not only help us all, they are critical for everybody, right? They are as important as clean air and healthy food, et cetera, whatever you want to put in there. So when you get the slides, I want you to look at these. These are things that I have heard. That the first quote is from the study itself. And then these are things that I've been hearing or reading since I discovered this study that really, really made me think, this is the next big thing that's happening. And so I decided that I was going to take Nadine Burke-Harris's advice and I was going to say, hell yeah, I'm going to shout it from the rooftops. You can see I'm pretty excited and pretty animated. This is who I am. You can take the girl out of New York, but you can't take New York out of the girl. Even 30 plus years later. But I just decided that I was going to, as the last gasp of my career, I was going to really push this until I had a reason not to, until some research told me that this was not right. And I'm pretty sure that's not going to happen because I've been doing this work long enough that, again, this research felt like it was confirming the lived experience and my professional experience that I had seen across 34 years at this point. So I love the fact that, this is about saying we can actually flourish. We are not just surviving, we can actually flourish even if there is adversity. And what we're going to talk about in a minute is how do we do that? It's all of our responsibility to put the building blocks or the ingredients together to do that. The good news is that resilience can trump ACEs. And that key positive childhood experiences not only promote optimal development, but also prevent and mitigate the effects of toxic stress. So this is pretty powerful for me, at least. And I hope that you're feeling a little bit of that as well. So one of the authors on this original positive childhood experiences study is a guy named Bob Segi he's an MD PhD at Tufts. And he is older than Christina Bethel. He was, I think, a little bit of a mentor, but anyway, he also had the sense of, I got to do something about this. And so he just started to think about how can we operationalize these 7 positive childhood experiences and all of the other things that we're starting to know, because there's a lot of literature about thriving and there's emerging literature about flourishing, and how can we operationalize them? And he started something called HOPE, Healthy Outcomes from Positive Experiences at Tufts. And these are the guiding principles of HOPE. Positive and negative factors that impact child health exist in all domains of the social ecology. So that means if you're a teacher, if you're a parent, if you are a scout leader or a youth leader, a coach, a therapist, a physician, a nurse, a frisk person, no matter how you interact with kids, paying attention to these positive and negative factors matter. And that the interplay, that interaction between individual, relational, community, and societal factors must be addressed in order to achieve optimal child health outcomes. Now, this is also being reflected in the work at the Center for the Developing Child at Harvard, which I pointed out to you was one of the places that I think is one of the coolest places around. And it's also being reflected in other work that's happening in other places. But this idea that this is located in all of us in the community, and we all have to work for it. So we have to have positive experience to promote child health, parent health, and a healthy parent-child relationship. And again, that speaks to this idea that if we're going to make the world good for kids and build healthy, well-adjusted, resilient people for the future, we have to build the adult capacities, the adult capabilities. We have to support the adults. And one of the last things I was involved at the Center on Trauma and Children was a really, really beautiful intervention for kids in foster adoptive homes who had experienced a lot of trauma. And what was unique about it was we never saw the kid. All the work we did was with the foster adoptive parents, because we realized that we have to stop trying to change kids. We have to change the environments around them and the relationships. And then they, because of that tremendous, beautiful neuroplasticity, will respond and they will grow in the ways that we want them to grow. And so this really shifts our way of thinking. And of course, the last thing, which if depending on how you were trained, if you were trained as a social worker, you definitely kind of assume this. Some other disciplines are trained a little differently, but I think most people appreciate that the physical, the cognitive, the social, and the emotional are all connected. All right, so what are the 4 components of HOPE that are promoting positive experiences that came out of this positive childhood experiences work and they're continuing? And so these are the 4 areas: relationships, environment, engagement, and emotional growth. All right, so the good news is this is not rocket science, right? We do these things already. Now we are starting to have a framework and also some research that says this is why we have to do it with intentionality. And this is why this stuff matters, right? When I first came, there was a period of time where I was running a service in the community mental health center where I'm pretty sure that the staff who didn't work for me all said, oh God, don't go work for her. Number 1, you have to work really hard and she expects a lot. But number 2, you have to do all this soft, mushy stuff, right? You have to pay attention to all the soft, mushy stuff. Because my training and the fact that I was doing trauma work so early in my career made me appreciate some of this. And now I get to say, you know what, guys, there's some science behind this. These are models that are being tested and it turns out they're really important. All right, so let's dig into them a little bit and think about what do they mean for us. And here's where I want you guys to start to talk. So when we think about relationships through interpersonal activities, it's all of these realms. And so I think that we can kind of, operationalize it by thinking about family, school or work, and community, and how relationships happen in all of these realms. So my question to you is, in the roles that you play in the lives of children, how can you enhance and promote healthy relationships in any or all of these realms? So I'm curious to know how you can now take this idea and really intentionally embed it into the work that you do. So I would love to, I'll leave the slide up just so people have a reference point, but I would really like for you to unmute and to hear some thoughts or about anything else that I've said.
Your moment to shine, folks.
Yeah, don't be shy, because this is really a conversation, and this is newish. You know, it's, in some ways, it's new research building on ways of thinking that we've had for a long time. And you're practitioners and people, you're real people. You're working with kids, so you're living with them. Like, how do you see an opportunity to enhance and promote this? And sometimes the answer is, sometimes, I mean, there is no right answer, but sometimes it's not a hard thing, but it's something that we tend to overlook because we're looking for like the shiny penny.
Martina, did you want to ask?
Hey. Yeah, hi. I'm hoping my camera is working. I'm on a mobile device, and I'm hoping you can hear me too.
We can see and hear you both.
Great, perfect. This has been a very inspiring consideration for where we are in Berea. I'm a summer food service program and after school meal program sponsor with Grow Appalachia. And I feel like, especially when we're looking at planning for moving forward, is putting the positive childhood experiences at the center of our work, and also through the lens of equity, and that's through public spaces. And so I guess really quick, I'm gonna like flip the camera. Well, I'm just gonna flip my camera, but where I am right now is at our community garden site, and we're building an outdoor classroom for kiddos, and then also meeting space for foster parents, and then also for people who are being connected again with their families, and also working on creating like an ADA acceptable or accessible garden space, and then tying that into our USDA work as a child nutrition program sponsor. But it's really hard to figure out how to package this without it being like there's so many different goals, and we're looking at holistic experiences for building that resiliency in our community. It really is just about making the space and the environment and inviting people in. And so I'm just really excited to think about this webinar opportunity, just kind of jumpstarting that for us.
And I love this. First of all, kudos to you guys. This is beautiful work, and could be a beautiful model. And as we go through these 4 elements, the HOPE framework may offer you a way to organize what you're doing. I don't think it would change it necessarily, but it may help you to put things into the buckets and organize it. Yeah, so I see these incredible moments, opportunities for building relationship, like how everybody talks to the kids who come to your programs and responds to them, so that, you know, it's the difference between saying, where's your card or what's your number to track, and saying, hey, how are you today? Or, you know, are you having a good day? Whether you know the child or not, because over time, then you start to build those relationships. And anybody who's worked in a school knows that sometimes the strongest relationships that kids have in the school are not with their teachers, but they're with other staff in the school. And so, you know, you guys are an after school and other program, but we know how powerful those relationships are. And so infusing this idea that every interaction is part of a relationship. And so every interaction needs to say to the child, you matter to me in this moment, right? And how can we do that? How can we not only give people permission, but really encourage them to interact in that way and model it? Because we know that a kid can come in kind of tense or upset from something that happened in school, and somebody can say, hey, I'm glad to see you today. And that can change how the day feels, right? And it can help them manage and process whatever has not gone well in that day. And so every interaction, my staff used to tease me and say that they were going to get me a crown that said every interaction is a therapeutic interaction. And I think every moment is a resilience building moment and for relationships. So I think you have a lot of opportunities for that, but even just naming this. And when you're training people about how to do their job, to say, and how you talk to kids and how you relate to them, and your facial expression and your demeanor sends a message, and it really matters, right? No matter who we are in the life of a child. Now, that doesn't mean if you're a parent that you have to be like perfect all the time. Goodness knows. In fact, it means that, oh, when you're in a bad mood, you have this great opportunity to say, oh my gosh, I was in a really bad mood, or I'm really stressed right now. And to model, how do you deal with that? It doesn't mean that we pretend that the world is perfect or that we're fine all the time. It means being authentic. Other thoughts about things?
Becca?
Becca. Yeah, sure. I'm also a Berea person and big fan of Martina's work. So, hey, Martina. And I work with data and evaluation. And like you've said with research, if it doesn't get measured, it doesn't get changed. And we have safe, healthy, and supported in my organization. I work for education nonprofit serving Southeastern Kentucky. We have safe, healthy, and supported as one of our key indicators that we want to help make movement on those students that feel that way. But we don't have a good proxy data point for it. The best one we have right now is chronic absenteeism, but it's not the whole story. And so I'm curious what you have come across or other data that might be available at a school level or education level. We have a lot of really good resources, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, and so that's probably a question that I have to get back to you on, and just because I wasn't thinking along those lines for today. So I think that there probably are some proxy measures. The question that we have to figure out is how to introduce that, measuring them without adding too much burden to whoever's going to be reporting them out. And
be great to hear what other sites are using, and to see what we have survey data for some of these questions, but survey data depends on who shows up and how they're feeling that day.
Right.
It would be great to see what other folks are doing.
Yeah. And so let's open it up to anybody on the call if anybody is doing anything that measures things around relationships or has a thought. This could be a great topic for a future Lunch and Learn. Marcy?
Noted. Yep.
Yeah.
There's always a need for data points.
Yeah.
Mhm.
This is Amaya Mendoza Foundation for Healthy Kentucky. The Youth Behavioral Risk Survey indirectly has things that can point to that, because it does ask students about, eating at home and screen time and things that that kind of like can serve as proxies maybe for some of the relationship issues.
Yeah, and it does ask them about an adult in their life.
Yeah. And since I'm on the mic, I'm just going to add a little thing. I'm totally, the foundation completely supports the relationships through interpersonal activities model working in schools. But I do want to make a shout out for those adverse community environments, which are going to keep producing ACEs unless we work systemically and through policies to change them. And just to mention, for example, poverty, I think we all know has such a strong impact on whatever a family can do or how they're living. But I'm thinking even things like discrimination and racism, and the fact that in the past legislative session, we've just passed 2 bills that are very discriminatory, both in terms of race and the LGBTQ community. That's not going to help with trauma in schools. The fact that we have grandparents raising children because of the loss to the opioid epidemic of many of the parents. And so what are we doing in terms of a state, in terms of addressing these policies? I am the coalition coordinator for the Kentucky Coalition for Healthy Children, and we are trying to work on the policy. So I always, advocate for, let's work on these to, support resiliency, but let's also keep an eye on the big policies that are actually sometimes making things worse. We should at least try to make them better.
And I think that would be another great conversation, is to talk about at the policy level. So absolutely, if this is going to be located in the community, it has to be located in the community at both the practice and the policy levels. And so thank you, Amaya, for doing that. Amanda.
I'm Amanda. I'm a student in the MSW program at University of Kentucky.
Great.
For my practicum, I'm looking at if increased frequency of visitation via video visit for incarcerated parents improves parental mental health. And then the next step would be reunification rates ultimately, but measure the small thing first. What I hadn't thought of is how do we make the video visit enjoyable for the kids? Like, how do we make it not just an experience, but a positive experience?
Yeah, and I think that that could be a really powerful thing is, okay, so getting the video visits was the first challenge, like getting people to say, yes, the relationship matters and we have to actually have the quantity. And now to think about what makes that a qualitatively positive experience for both the parent and the child. And I would say that, that builds on some of the work at places like the Center for the Developing Child at Harvard, where they really talk about this idea of serve and return, right? So we know that parent-child relationships and relationships between adults and children in general are very transactional, and they go back and forth. And so how we respond to children then gives them a cue about how they are going to respond and open up more or less, or engage more or less, or lean in more or less, just as the child does that for us, right? And so for parents and kids who have been separated, one of the things you may want to think about is how can you help coach parents to be patient, to not feel rejected if their child isn't totally engaged, to not feel like a failure, and to incrementally start to rebuild that connection and that relationship. The burden, unfortunately, is on the parent to do that, especially with younger children. But really, in most cases, the burden is on us as the adult in that relationship.
Sure.
And so I think that there could be some really interesting things. If you want to, my email is going to be at the end of the slides. If you want to email me, and I'll think more about what other things I think, but I think that's a beautiful thing. So I want us to move on to talk about a couple of other things, but I think this gives you an idea about how to operationalize it. One thing that I wanted to say about this idea of, sure, Amanda, thank you for your work. What I want to say about this idea of relationships is that I think that this is a way that we all have to say things like, you know what, cutting after school programs is not okay. Cutting the buses after school is not okay. Taking kids' recess away as a punishment is not okay. Cutting recess in school, not letting kids talk in the cafeteria is not okay. Making kids walk in lines all the time, like maybe in the hallway if you have to keep quiet down or whatever, but like we have to encourage normal, non-rigid interactions for kids in all areas of their life, right? All the time. The dinner table project of eating dinner together, and for actually, Amanda, that could be a great model for you guys for your program, is to create something that has some prompts for parents to ask kids to get the conversation going, just like the dinner table project did for prompts for around the dinner table. And so we have to really, really think about what are the small things that we can do that can pack a big punch and that make a big difference, that sometimes we think, oh, either we assume people are going to do, or we think that's not within our professional realm. It's not professional. Well, guess what? It's all part of this professional. And so I think it's really, really important. Jessica, thank you so much. And you might have some really important learnings and offerings for Amanda and that project. So if you're willing, that may be a beautiful opportunity for you guys to connect. Okay, so I'm going to go through a couple of, we only have a few minutes left. Oh, sorry. See, look at what I did. I did something crazy. This just talks about, from some of the big thinkers out there, why connections are so important. This talks about what we just talked about, this idea of serve and return and that resilience. Oops, that's not even supposed to be in there. Okay, sorry, that was from another another training I'm doing. But this idea of environments, Amalia, really pointed to this idea of safe, equitable, and stable environments for living, playing, and learning. So there is no way we can do that just on an individual basis or just with a family, because families are often having to navigate challenges that destabilize the environment, that put them in environments that are not safe and certainly not equitable. And the equity piece of this is like a whole other lunch and learn. And there are people who are far more qualified than I to really speak to how to start to address that. Or I have a colleague who I do a lot of work with, and maybe we could put something together. So I want to give a nod to that and say, we're not going to like do a deep dive. But when we think about what does it mean to create safe, equitable, and stable environments? What can we do one-on-one and at the family level? What's our responsibility in the community? What's our responsibility as advocates? And how do we have to really push for policy? And this brings in larger discussions around culture too. And I've recently been doing some work around around folks who are coming from other countries as political or climate refugees. And, the role of culture is really important to think about as well. Even for those of us who have been here for a while, we all have a variety of cultures. And so to really think about how we operationalize this. And so things like green space matter, trees in a community, being able to get natural sunlight. I mean, my child went to a high school where there were internal classrooms with no windows. I mean, I really couldn't get my head around this, right? I don't know how that happened, but anyway. So things like this that really, really matter and make a difference. Addressing environmental toxins in communities. This is part of our work as behavioral health people as well. And so we have to ally with folks in those spaces, but also embrace it as part and parcel of building resilience in our youth and our adults. Oops, sorry. I don't know why that's doing that. And so I put some things out there that, we're always thinking about and talking about, and creating opportunities for that sense of belonging. And one of the things that we know builds resilience, which is related to what's coming, is this idea of meaning making. And that comes from engagement and it comes from social and emotional growth. But we have to make sure that people feel that they are valuable and that they are connected to this larger society and community. And so how do we promote engagement? And, we are pretty good at starting to do that in families, although sometimes, again, I think we think, oh, that's not part of our professional role. But how can we also do it in other realms? And what do we need to be reminding people? No, you know what? It's actually not okay to not let a kid do this. And so, or to take this away as punishment. And how do we, say, yes, there are natural consequences, and sometimes there are consequences that we have to impart for behaviors or decisions that are not healthy and are not helpful, et cetera, because that's the way that we learn. And how do we want to do that? Somebody texted me, if you can believe this, Missouri, a school district in Missouri has reinstated corporal punishment. After having taken it out of their district in 2001, they've now decided that they're going to put it back, which I said, oh, that might make us actually look better. At least we didn't say no and then bring it back. We just never said no in some places. But at any rate, we have to really think about these things. What does all of this mean? And so what's our role? And then this last thing is opportunities for social and emotional growth, which I think is, familiar to us, but how can we again be very, very intentional? And these 4 elements pull together so many things that are happening, like, resilience work, growth mindset, being courageous, et cetera, et cetera. We want to be very careful about some of these, that we're addressing equity and that we're not asking people to be resilient in the face of oppression or discrimination, which nobody should have to be resilient about. We should change the system. We also want to recognize that sometimes courage has some ethnic and racial bias built into it that if you don't have a strong foundation, it's pretty hard to be courageous. But so I want to recognize some of that, but I want us to be very intentional about thinking things through and connecting them. So I gave you a bunch of resources that can help you further your inquiry and exploration of some of this. I also gave you resources for staff resilience, because another part of the work that I do is around building staff resilience. And this is hard work. And when you take on this responsibility and you're actually not taking it on, you already have it. But when you recognize the responsibility, it can be overwhelming and it can wear on you. And so we want people like you all to be able to sustain doing the work and not get burned out, not experience secondary trauma. So I now in every thing I do, I share some of these resources. So I just share them with you for that. And I invite you to please feel free to reach out, and I'll share the slides, the cleaned up version of the slides without the mistakes, with Marcy, and I will stay on if anybody has any more that they want to talk about. I'm sorry that we went long. But the great beginning conversations, maybe you guys can continue this somehow. So unmute, say something. Questions, thoughts?